The wind, a ceaseless mourner across the vast, unforgiving plains of the Montana Territory in 1887, was Amos Weston's most constant companion. It whispered through the sparse, sun-bleached grasses of his ranch, rattled the ill-fitting window panes of his solitary cabin, and carried the scent of dust and distant rain, promises often broken. The land was a harsh mistress, demanding everything and giving back just enough to keep a man tethered to hope, or perhaps to despair. For Amos, it was more than land. It was a legacy, bought with the sweat and sorrow of his father, and now his own. But even this legacy was under threat. A clause in his father's will stipulating that if he remained unmarried and without prospect of an heir by his 35th birthday, a date looming like a storm cloud, a significant portion of the ranch would be forfeit to a blight Stiffings. Distant, grasping Jusen had never met. Amos was a man carved from the unyielding landscape itself. Tall and lean, with eyes the color of a winter sky, he moved with a quiet economy of motion born of endless labor and a profound, bone-deep weariness. Grief had been his shadow for 5 long years, since diphtheria had stolen his young wife, Martha, and their infant son, leaving behind a silence in the cabin that even the wind could not fill. He had become a creature of routine, his days measured by the needs of his cattle and the turning of the seasons, his heart a locked room, its key long lost. Loneliness was a bitter draught he drank daily, the expectation of losing his land a constant, dull ache beneath the surface of his stoic resolve. His stasis was one of hard-won endurance, a life lived in the muted colors of survival rather than joy. The cabin, small and sparsely furnished, held the ghosts of laughter and love, now only amplifying his solitude. He spoke little, even to his horse, his thoughts turning inward, a somber, circular path of memory and obligation. The approaching deadline of the will felt like a tightening noose, not just for the land, but for the finality it represented. Another failure, another loss in a life already too marked by them. He saw no way out, save for a miracle, and Amos Weston had long since stopped believing in those. Then she appeared, not as a miracle, but as a stark testament to desperation. He found her collapsed near the creek that marked the western edge of his property, a wisp of a woman, her clothes ragged, her face pale and gaunt under a layer of trail dust. She looked like a bird fallen from the sky, fragile and utterly spent. He'd almost mistaken her for a discarded bundle of rags, until a faint, shuddering breath caught his ear. Her name, he would later learn, was Abigail Hale, and she was starving, a refugee from a life that had clearly offered her nothing but hardship. Abigail's initial state was one of profound vulnerability. Her eyes, when she managed to open them, were wide with a hunted fear, the deep, hollowed sockets speaking of days, perhaps weeks, without proper sustenance. She was young, younger than he'd first thought, yet her gaze held an oldness, a weariness that belied her years. There was no fight left in her, only a fragile hold on life itself. She carried nothing but the clothes on her back and a story she seemed too weak or too wary to tell. She was an outcast, adrift, a stark contrast to his own rooted, if precarious, existence. Her presence in his cabin, once he'd carried her limp form back, was an immediate and profound disruption. The silence was broken, not by words, but by her shallow breathing, by the clink of the spoon against the bowl as he managed to get some thin broth past her lips. His routine, so rigidly defined, fractured. He was a rancher, a man of cattle and fences, not a nursemaid. Yet, he couldn't leave her to die. As she slowly regained a sliver of strength over the next 2 days, an idea, unwelcome and purely pragmatic, began to take root in Amos's mind. She was a woman. He needed a wife, at least in name, to satisfy the will. The thought was cold, transactional, born of his own desperation rather than any nascent feeling for the stranger under his roof. It was a problem, her presence, her needs, but it also presented a stark, uncomfortable solution. The tension in the small cabin became a palpable thing, thick with unspoken questions and the looming shadow of his impossible predicament. When Abigail was finally strong enough to sit up and speak more than a few hoarse words, Amos laid out his proposition with a bluntness that bordered on cruel, though cruelty was not his intent. He simply knew no other way. He explained his situation with the land, the terms of the will, his impending deadline. He omitted the depth of his connection to the ranch, the ghosts that walked it with him. He offered her a roof, food, protection of a sort, in exchange for her name on a marriage certificate. A marriage of convenience, he called it, devoid of any expectation beyond the legal. Abigail listened, her large, still frightened eyes fixed on his face. Her own past was a raw wound, a tale of betrayal and loss that had driven her to the desperate flight that ended at his creek. She had nothing, no one. The thought of regular meals, of a place to sleep where she wasn't looking over her shoulder, was a powerful lure, even if the price was tying herself to this grim, silent man and his lonely ranch. She saw the hardness in him, but also a flicker of something else, a weariness that mirrored her own, perhaps. With a voice barely above a whisper, choked with the dust of her recent past and the uncertainty of her future, she accepted. There were no other options. Their journey to the small, dusty settlement of Redemption, the nearest place with a preacher, was made mostly in silence. Amos drove the buckboard, his gaze fixed on the horizon, while Abigail sat beside him, clutching a shawl he'd given her, a small, hunched figure lost in the vastness of the prairie. The preacher, a stern man named Mr. Blackwood, asked few questions, his eyes lingering on Abigail's thin frame and Amos's grim demeanor. The vows they exchanged were hollow, functional words, spoken into the stale air of the clapboard church, witnessed only by the preacher's curious wife. The ring Amos placed on Abigail's finger was a thin gold band he'd bought from the general store, a stark symbol of their stark arrangement. Back at the ranch, the silence in the cabin felt different, heavier. It was no longer the silence of solitude, but of two strangers bound together by necessity, sharing a space but not a life. Suspicion was a constant undercurrent. Amos watched Abigail, wondering if she would try to run, if she had hidden depths of deceit, if she was simply biding her time. He was a man accustomed to being alone, and her presence, her quiet movements in his space, felt like an intrusion, a constant reminder of the desperate pact he'd made. Abigail, in turn, observed Amos with a wary caution. She feared his moods, his long silences, the curt, functional way he addressed her. She didn't know what he truly expected of her beyond her signature on a piece of paper. She ate sparingly, as if afraid the food might be snatched away, and made herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. The cabin offered physical shelter, but emotionally, she remained out in the cold, an uneasy truce her only protection. Practical interactions were born of necessity. Amos provided, as promised. He showed her where things were kept, explained the workings of the wood stove, the routine of the ranch. He portioned out her chores, tending the small vegetable garden he'd long neglected, mending clothes, keeping the cabin clean, tasks she performed with a quiet diligence that surprised him. He'd expected, he wasn't sure what he'd expected, perhaps resistance or incompetence. Instead, he found a quiet capability. Days bled into weeks. The vast sky arced over the ranch, indifferent to the fragile, unacknowledged tension within the cabin walls. Amos worked from sunup to sundown, finding solace in the familiar rhythms of ranch life, yet always aware of Abigail's presence when he returned, a silent figure by the hearth or setting out their meager evening meal. Meals were eaten in almost complete silence, the clinking of cutlery, the loudest sound. He'd grunt a terse thank you for the food, and she'd nod, her eyes usually downcast. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the sharp edges of their enforced proximity began to soften, worn down by the shared quiet and the rhythm of their days. One evening, a late summer storm blew in with sudden fury, the wind howling like a tormented spirit, rain lashing against the cabin. A loose shutter banged persistently against the wall. Amos, muttering about the noise, went out into the teeth of the gale to fix it. He returned soaked and shivering, fumbling with the latch. Abigail, without a word, had a towel ready and had stoked the fire, a mug of hot, weak coffee already steaming on the hearth. He took them, his surprise hidden behind a gruff nod. It was a small thing, but it was the first unsolicited act of care either had offered the other beyond the barest necessity. He began to notice things about her. The way her hands, though chapped and thin, moved with a surprising deftness as she kneaded bread dough he hadn't realized she knew how to make. The way she would sometimes pause in her work in the garden, her head tilted, listening to the song of a meadowlark, a fleeting softness in her eyes. He saw her mending one of his old, threadbare shirts with stitches so fine they were almost invisible. He hadn't asked her to, she simply did it. One afternoon he found her by the creek, not listless as before, but carefully sketching in the damp earth with a stick. He paused, hidden by the cottonwoods, and watched. She was drawing the wildflowers that grew along the bank, her concentration absolute. When she looked up and saw him, a blush stained her pale cheeks, and she quickly smoothed the drawing away with her foot. He said nothing, but the image stayed with him. It was a glimpse of a person beyond the starving woman, a hint of a life and interests he knew nothing about. She too began to see beyond his forbidding exterior. She witnessed his patience with a newborn calf struggling to find its feet, the gentle way he spoke to his aging horse. One day, while cleaning, she found a small, carved wooden bird tucked away on a high shelf, clearly old and cherished. She wondered about its story, about the hands that had made it, and saw in its careful craftsmanship a hidden softness in the man who owned it. She learned to read his silences, to distinguish the weary quiet from the angry tension. She started to realize his gruffness was more a habit than a true reflection of his nature, a shield against a world that had dealt him harsh blows. Slowly, tentatively, small disclosures began to bridge the chasm between them. He asked, one evening, where she'd learned to garden so well. She told him, her voice hesitant at first, about her childhood on a small farm far to the east, a farm lost to drought and debt. She didn't speak of the betrayals that followed, but the pain was evident in her voice. He listened, his usual taciturnity replaced by a quiet attentiveness. Another time, she dared to ask about the brand on his cattle, a simple W intertwined with a smaller M. His face tightened for a moment, and then he spoke, his voice rough, of his father, and then more softly, of Martha. It was the first time he'd said his late wife's name aloud to another person in years. The shared vulnerability hung in the air, fragile but real. The shift was subtle, like the turning of the seasons. The silence at meals became less strained, occasionally punctuated by a shared observation about the weather or the cattle. He started leaving a small portion of his tobacco for her to use in the garden, having noticed her carefully collecting wood ash to deter pests. She began to save him the choicest pieces of jerky when she prepared their trail rations. These were small gestures, unspoken acknowledgments of a growing, reluctant reliance, a budding empathy that neither had anticipated nor sought. He still thought of the land, of the will, but now, when he looked at Abigail, he saw not just a solution to his problem, but a woman quietly, resiliently, making a life in the harsh soil of his own. The county of redemption, small and insular, had not failed to notice Amos Weston's sudden marriage. Gossip, like tumbleweed, had rolled through the town's single dusty street and out to the surrounding homesteads. Amos, always a solitary figure, had become even more of one in their eyes, his marriage to a nameless, starving woman seen as an act of desperation, or perhaps even folly. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, a man whose opinions carried weight, had been heard to remark that Weston was either touched in the head or hiding something. Others, like Jedediah Croft, Amos's ambitious and unpleasant cousin who stood to gain from the will, fanned the flames of suspicion, hoping to find grounds to contest the marriage and claim the land he felt was rightfully his. He'd made a pointed visit to redemption, spreading whispers about the mysterious bride. The external pressure began to mount as autumn deepened, the days growing shorter, the wind carrying the first bite of winter. There were whispers in town that Amos's wife was sickly, perhaps even a burden. Some speculated she was a runaway, maybe even a woman of ill repute. When Abigail accompanied Amos to town for supplies, a rare occurrence he usually undertook alone, she felt the weight of curious, often hostile, stares. The women of the town, gathered outside Henderson's mercantile, fell silent as she passed, their eyes dissecting her patched dress, her quiet demeanor. It was a prejudice she had known before, but here it felt sharper, aimed not just at her, but through her, at Amos and his precarious hold on his life. The primary threat, however, materialized not from gossip, but from the land itself, amplified by human greed. A blight, insidious and swift, began to creep through the late crops in the county. It started in the cornfields, a sickly yellowing of the stalks, then spread to the potatoes, leaving them rotten in the ground. Panic began to ripple through the small farming community. Winter stores were threatened, and the prospect of a lean, hungry season loomed large. Amos's own small crop of winter wheat, vital for seeing his cattle through the harshest months and providing flour for themselves, began to show the telltale signs of the spreading sickness. He inspected the fields daily, his face growing grimmer with each inspection. The land he fought to keep was now threatening to starve them. This crisis forced Amos and Abigail into closer collaboration. They worked side by side in the fields, trying to salvage what they could, the shared anxiety a palpable thing between them. The blight tested their resilience, but it also solidified their unspoken partnership. He saw her determination, her refusal to succumb to despair, even as their hopes dwindled with each wilting stalk. She saw his quiet strength, his dogged persistence in the face of yet another devastating blow. The threat of losing the crop, and potentially the ranch if they couldn't sustain themselves, far outweighed the distant threat of the will. This was immediate, tangible. Jedediah Croft chose this moment of vulnerability to escalate his campaign. He arrived at the ranch unannounced, his city clothes and smug demeanor a stark contrast to the dust and toil of the Weston place. He'd brought a lawyer from a bigger town, a man with cold eyes and a briefcase full of implied threats. Croft made a cursory, insincere inquiry about the blight, then launched into a thinly veiled accusation that Amos's marriage was a sham, a desperate attempt to circumvent the will. He demanded to speak to Abigail alone, implying she was being held against her will, or was somehow unfit. Amos, his temper usually held in check by years of stoic control, felt a surge of protective anger he hadn't experienced in years. He stepped in front of Abigail, his stance unyielding. "My wife is not to be troubled by you, cousin," he stated, his voice low and dangerous. "Our marriage is our business. The state of my crops is my concern. You've no standing here." The lawyer began to speak of legal challenges, of depositions and court orders. Croft smirked, clearly enjoying Amos's discomfort, seeing the strain of the failing crops and this new pressure taking its toll. The stakes were suddenly immense. The land, their survival, the fragile peace they had begun to build, all hung in the balance. It was clear Croft would use any means necessary, and the blight provided him with leverage, painting Amos as an incompetent farmer, unable to manage his affairs, let alone a wife. The community, already wary, might easily be swayed if starvation became a real prospect. The need for decisive action, for some way to fight back against both the natural disaster and human malice, became desperately urgent. It was in this crucible of fear and impending loss that Abigail's quiet strength began to shine in an unexpected way. As Amos wrestled with the grim prognosis for his wheat and the legal threats from Croft, Abigail spent hours walking the blighted fields, her brow furrowed in thought. She crumbled the diseased leaves in her fingers, smelled the strangely sweet scent of decay, her mind sifting through memories, fragments of knowledge long dormant. She recalled her grandfather, a man who had experimented with old farming ways, who spoke of companion planting and natural remedies for crop sicknesses he'd learned from his own immigrant parents, and even from conversations with local Native American elders he'd respected. One evening, as Amos sat staring into the fire, the weight of the world on his shoulders, Abigail approached him, a hesitant hope in her eyes. "Amos," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I think I might know something that could help. With the wheat, it's a long chance, but—" He looked up, his expression bleak. "There's nothing to be done, Abigail. It's the blight. It's taken near everything in the county." "Perhaps not everything," she persisted. "My grandfather, he used to treat a similar sickness in his crops, with a wash made from fermented horsetail and willow bark, and he would plant certain herbs amongst the wheat, things that strengthened the soil and deterred the sickness." She described the process, the specific plants, some of which she'd seen growing wild along the creek banks. It sounded like folklore, like an old wife's tale, completely at odds with the modern farming advice dispensed by the agricultural pamphlets Henderson occasionally stocked. Amos was skeptical, deeply so. His own father had been a man of practical, proven methods. Yet he looked at Abigail's earnest face, the quiet conviction in her eyes. He saw the desperation there, but also a spark of something else, a fierce intelligence, a resilience he was only just beginning to comprehend. He had nothing left to lose. The crop was failing anyway. Croft was circling like a vulture. "What would we need?" he asked, the words feeling heavy, a concession to a hope he didn't dare fully embrace. Her face lit up. "Horsetail, willow bark, I know where to find them." And I'll need to dig up some yarrow and chamomile. We'll need to work quickly. The next few days were a blur of activity. While Amos, his skepticism warring with a desperate sliver of hope, continued to manage the cattle, Abigail, with a focus that was almost fierce, gathered her ingredients. She brewed her concoctions in the big laundry cauldron, the strange, earthy scents filling the small cabin. She meticulously transplanted the herbs amongst the rows of struggling wheat, her hands working with a knowledge that seemed innate. Some of the ranch hands from neighboring properties, seeing her strange activities from a distance, reported back to their employers, and the whispers in redemption grew louder. Weston's mail-order bride is a witch, some said, driven mad by starvation, trying to cure the blight with weeds and potions. Jedediah Croft, hearing these rumors, saw his opportunity. He rallied a small group of the most fearful and superstitious townsfolk, along with the lawyer, and descended upon the Weston ranch again, this time with an air of righteous indignation. They found Abigail in the field, her dress stained with mud and plant juices, tending to her strange ministrations. "What is this madness, Weston?" Croft demanded, his voice dripping with scorn, loud enough for his companions to hear. "Are you going to let this woman destroy what little you have left with her heathen practices? The whole county is laughing, or worse, fearing contamination from your land." This was the moment, the townsfolk murmured, their faces a mixture of fear and accusation. The lawyer stepped forward, ready to speak of legal injunctions, of declaring Amos unfit. Amos looked at Abigail, standing small and defiant amidst the dying wheat, her hands dirty, her chin held high. He saw not madness, but a desperate courage. He saw the woman who had brought a quiet order to his chaotic home, who had shown him small kindnesses, who had shared her meager past with him, and in that moment, something shifted irrevocably within him. His land, his legacy, was important, but suddenly, defending this woman, this stranger who had become something more, felt more critical. He stepped forward, placing himself between Abigail and the accusers. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried the weight of conviction. "This is my land," he said, his gaze sweeping over the hostile faces. "And this is my wife. What she does here, she does with my full consent and support. Her methods may be unfamiliar to you, but they are born of knowledge, not madness. We are trying to save our crop, something none of you have offered to help us do, only to criticize and condemn." He looked directly at Croft. "And you, cousin, have no say here. Your concern is for my land, not for my welfare or the welfare of this community. Now, I suggest you all leave my property." His unexpected, forceful defense of Abigail stunned the group into silence. Croft, his face mottled with rage, sputtered about legal action, but Amos stood firm, an unyielding wall. Reluctantly, muttering amongst themselves, the townsfolk and Croft's contingent retreated. Abigail looked at Amos, her eyes shining with unshed tears, a silent thank you passing between them. He had stood by her, publicly, against them all. The following weeks were a tense vigil. Abigail continued her treatments, and slowly, miraculously, a change began to occur in a patch of the treated wheat. The yellowing seemed to halt, then recede. New green shoots, tentative but strong, began to appear. It wasn't a total recovery, not by any means, but a significant portion of Amos's wheat, the section Abigail had most intensively treated, began to show signs of resilience, fighting off the blight that had decimated nearly every other field in the county. News of this, when it finally trickled out, was met first with disbelief, then with a grudging curiosity. Farmers, desperate for any solution, began to visit the Weston ranch, not to mock, but to observe, to ask hesitant questions. Abigail, with Amos quietly at her side, explained her methods, sharing what knowledge she had without hesitation. She spoke of soil health, of the plants that could help, of the balance of nature. She wasn't a witch, she was a woman with ancestral wisdom, a keen observer of the natural world. The climax of this unfolding drama occurred at the hastily convened county meeting, held in the Redemption Church, to discuss the winter food crisis. The atmosphere was somber, filled with fear and a sense of helplessness. Speaker after speaker recounted their losses. When Amos Weston was called upon, a hush fell over the room. He stood, and then, to everyone's surprise, he gestured for Abigail to join him. She was nervous, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, but as she began to speak, her voice gained strength. She didn't boast of her success, but humbly offered what she knew. She described the plants, the preparations, the underlying principles of working with nature, rather than against it. She offered to show anyone interested how to identify the herbs, how to prepare the washes for future plantings. She spoke of community, of sharing knowledge for the common good. The initial shock in the room was profound. This was the starving woman, the mail-order bride, the supposed witch. And she was offering them not just hope, but practical solutions, her intelligence and quiet dignity undeniable. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, was the first to break the silence. "Well, I'll be," he said, a look of genuine surprise on his face. "It seems we may have misjudged you, Mistress Weston, severely." Others murmured agreement. Even some of the women who had stared her down now looked at her with a newfound respect. Jedediah Croft, sitting at the back, looked apoplectic, his scheme to discredit Amos and Abigail crumbling before his eyes. What Abigail had done, with her quiet knowledge and unwavering spirit, had indeed shocked the whole county, shocked them out of their prejudice, their fear, and into a grudging, then growing, admiration. Her actions had not only saved a crucial part of Amos's crop, thus securing his land from Croft's immediate legal threats which now seemed petty and malicious, but had offered a lifeline to the entire community. The immediate outcome was a subtle but seismic shift in redemption. The blight was not magically gone, but Abigail's methods, when cautiously adopted by a few desperate farmers for their small late-sown garden plots or in preparation for the next season, showed promise. More importantly, the wall of suspicion around Abigail and Amos began to crumble. They were no longer outcasts. Abigail's quiet courage and unexpected wisdom had earned them a measure of respect, even gratitude. Croft's legal posturing lost all credibility in the face of this community-wide crisis, and Abigail's demonstrable contribution. He left redemption a diminished figure, his greed exposed. In the aftermath, as winter settled over the plains, the cabin on the Weston ranch felt different. The silence was no longer heavy with unspoken anxieties, but filled with a quiet contentment. The shared struggle, the public defense, and the subsequent, astonishing success had forged a bond between Amos and Abigail that neither could have predicted. The marriage, born of desperation and convenience, had found an unexpected foundation of mutual respect and burgeoning affection. Amos looked at Abigail not as a means to an end, but as his partner, his wife in truth. He saw the strength that had been hidden beneath her fragile exterior, the intelligence that had saved them. He found himself seeking out her opinion, sharing his thoughts, his quiet laughter, even making a rare appearance. Abigail, in turn, no longer felt like a frightened refugee. She had found a home, a purpose, and in Amos, a steadfast protector and a companion. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a calm confidence. She continued to tend her garden, now with Amos often working beside her, learning from her, their hands brushing as they reached for the same tool. The small carved wooden bird she had found now sat on the mantelpiece, a symbol of the past acknowledged and the future tentatively embraced. Their new stasis was one of shared endeavor, of quiet understanding. The ranch, once a place of solitary grief for Amos and fearful uncertainty for Abigail, became a sanctuary, a testament to their resilience. Their life settled into a new rhythm, marked by the seasons and the steady, quiet growth of their connection. The county, having been shocked into a new awareness, treated them with a respect that bordered on admiration. Abigail's knowledge of plants and remedies was sought after, and she shared it freely, becoming an unlikely but valued member of the community. They were no longer Amos Weston and that starving woman he married, but the Westons, a couple who had faced adversity together and emerged stronger. The land, once a source of anxiety and potential loss, now felt truly theirs, a shared inheritance they were building together. The echoes of their journey resonated deeply. The raw, unforgiving frontier had tested them, had stripped them bare, but in doing so, had revealed their true capacities, Amos's for renewed trust and protective love, Abigail's for profound courage and life-giving wisdom. The initial prejudice they faced had been overcome not by confrontation alone, but by the undeniable power of Abigail's contribution, an act of unexpected kindness and intelligence that benefited all. Their story became a quiet legend in the county, a testament to resilience, the surprising ways connection can bloom in the harshest soil. and the profound truth that a person's worth is never defined by their beginnings or the judgments of others. They had found not just survival, but a deep and abiding belonging, a home forged in the heart of shared hardship and unexpected grace. The wind still swept across the plains, but now, for Amos and Abigail, it carried not just the scent of dust, but the quiet promise of a shared future, earned and cherished.